I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
He's looking at you, kid.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Oh, I've been thinking.
Well, what do you want to do that for?
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
Welcome to 99 Years, 100 Films, the podcast where we look at every winner of the Best Picture Academy Award in release order and see why the film is so highly regarded. I'm Trey Hooks, and with me, as always, is my co-host Blaine Dowler. How are you today, Blaine?
I'm good. How about you?
Good, thank you. This time we are taking a trip to South Africa and then to India. No, we are not covering the most recent Indiana Jones release. We're looking at the 55th Annual Academy Awards covering films released in 1982 and the Best Picture winner of that year, Ghandi, directed by Richard Attenborough. Ghandi premiered on December 7th, 1982 in LA, with a wide release in the US on February 25th, 1983, and featured Ben Kingsley as Mahatma Gandhi, Rohini Hattagandhi as Kasturba Gandhi, Roshan Seth as Jawaharlal Nehru, and Ian Charleston as Charles Freer Andrews. The film's screenplay was written by John Briley. I'll take us into the synopsis, coming as always from the contributors at Wikipedia. On the 30th of January, 1948, on his way to an evening prayer service, an elderly Gandhi is helped out for his evening walk to meet a large number of greeters and admirers. One visitor, Naturam Gauds, shoots him point blank in the chest. His state funeral is shown, the procession attended by millions of people from all walks of life, with a radio reporter speaking eloquently about Gandhi's world-changing life and works. In June 1893, the 23-year-old Gandhi is thrown off from a South African train for being an Indian sitting in a first-class compartment, despite him having a first-class ticket. Realizing the laws are biased even against well-educated and successful Indians, he then decides to start a nonviolent protest campaign for the rights of all Indians in South Africa, arguing that they are British subjects and entitled to the same rights and privileges as whites. After numerous arrests and unwelcome international attention, the government finally relents by recognizing some rights for Indians. In 1915, as a result of his victory in South Africa, Gandhi is invited back to India, where he is now considered something of a national hero. He's urged to take up the fight for India's independence from the British Empire. The synopsis jumps to Gandhi agrees. I'll just divert from the synopsis for just a little bit here. Gandhi actually, in the film, initially demurs, feeling that he's been separated from his home country for too long to kind of adequately represent the Indian people. So he essentially does a walkabout and spends times, especially with the peasant class within the Indian caste system. And then he agrees and mounts a violent non-cooperation campaign of unprecedented scale, coordinating millions of Indians nationwide. There are some setbacks, such as violence against the protesters or by the protesters themselves, Gandhi's occasional imprisonment, and the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar. Nevertheless, the campaign generates great attention and Britain faces intense public pressure. In 1930, Gandhi protests against the British-imposed salt tax via a highly symbolic salt march. This essentially involves him leading a protest march to the sea, where he then proceeds to make salt from the salt water, which was illegal at the time because Britain was the only one who could legally trade in salt in India.
Which is a law that was imposed for the sole purpose of keeping India subverted and under control.
Exactly. They make the statement that the two things necessary for life in India are water and salt, and the British Empire must control both. He also travels to London for a conference concerning Britain's possible departure from India. This, however, proves fruitless. Ghandi spends much of the Second World War in prison for not supporting the war. During a period under house arrest, his wife dies. After the war ends, India finally wins its independence. Indians celebrate this victory, but their troubles are far from over. The country is subsequently partitioned by religion. It is decided that the northwest and eastern part of India, which is current-day Bangladesh, both places where Muslims are in the majority, will become a new country called Pakistan. It is hoped that by permitting the Muslims to live in a separate country, violence will abate. Ghandi is opposed to the idea and is even willing to allow Muhammad Ali Jinnah to become the first Prime Minister of India. But the partition of India is carried out nevertheless. Religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims erupt into nationwide violence. Repulsed by this sudden unrest, Ghandi declares a hunger strike, in which he will not eat until the fighting stops. The fighting does stop eventually. Ghandi spends his last days trying to bring about peace between both nations. He thereby angers many dissidents on both sides, one of whom is involved in a conspiracy to assassinate him. Ghandi is cremated and his ashes are scattered on the Ganges. As this happens, viewers hear Ghandi in another voiceover from earlier in the film. And that was a very abbreviated synopsis of a 3-hour film. I tried to add a little bit more context as I went through it, but let's start where we normally do with our initial experiences with this film. Was this your first time watching it, Blaine?
It was, yes. How about you?
It was the first time for me as well.
Okay, yeah. I think we were both warned online, and at least I was warned by some people in person, that this is a slow film. I've got my sister and mother warned me that they both tried to watch it and couldn't get through it because it is so slow. I actually quite enjoyed it, and I found that the slow pacing is appropriate to the person Ghandi was. He was very determined, and if change was necessary, he'd want to change today. But he's not the kind of person who leads a revolution by running into battle with a weapon in his hands. He's not a war hero. Right? He's the one that says, okay, let's fight them by not doing anything. Let's have a national day of prayer where every single citizen is home praying so the trains don't run, the shops don't open. Let's do it that way.
I didn't necessarily experience it as slow, so I watched it on the July 4th holiday for us. And, at the intermission point in the film, I did kind of get up, stretch my legs, move the laundry I was washing from, the washing machine to the dryer. So, I took a very small break during the intermission, just like you might actually do at the time during the showing of the film. I didn't experience it as slow per se, but I can see that criticism because this is a biopic without a lot of personal conflict, if you follow what I'm saying. There's conflict, but, for example, other than one scene where Ghandi gets angry with his wife, you rarely see Ghandi in emotional conflict with someone else.
Yeah, it's almost like the people who've written for Captain America. They say the biggest problem with Captain America is it's hard to put him through a personal story arc because he is a fully formed and moral character at the beginning of the story. There's not a lot of room for growth. And I think the real life person of Ghandi, he's got the same issues, right? He's not the one learning lessons. He's the one teaching them. He is there. If every ruler in the world was like Ghandi, this would be a much better world to be in.
And I've heard that as a criticism of the film. I work with several people of Indian descent, and I didn't pull them or ask them because I didn't want to be disrespectful, but just as I was reading some of the critical analysis and history of the film, there are some folks who say that while the film captures the spirit of Ghandi and his message, that it covers over the cracks of his humanity, if we will. We see it a little bit, like it didn't come through stridently in the film, but for example, his initial campaign in South Africa, there are some people who say that wasn't really aimed at getting rights for all Indians, but that it was, at the time he was what would be an upper middle class or upper class Indian within the British Empire, and he felt like they should be, that, his social strata should be treated as such in South Africa and not treated like the peasant class. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's an example to where maybe it hazed up maybe some of his imperfections. I did find it really interesting that kind of the linchpin of the South African campaign for someone who would be known for, let's get my country out of the rule of the British, was kind of, dang it, we're British citizens. British citizens shouldn't be treated this way. So his indignity and his pride was less about his own cultural identity at that point, but his appropriated cultural identity.
Yeah, we can see that is, I guess, an element of change done after he lived with the people to get back in touch with them. Because yes, he does start predominantly British. As for the classism, that I don't know for sure if that's true, but it strikes me as reasonable. For the past 4 years, I've been teaching in a Sikh cultural school here in Edmonton. We're actually recording a little over a week after my last day there, because I'm moving on to a different school this fall that's just starting its high school grade. So this will be I'll be there for the first year they teach grade 11, and the next year will be the first year they teach grade 12. And classism is still a bigger problem in India than it is in North America. North American classism seems to be determined. There is classism in North America, some of it by race, but it feels like more of that is based on, how far to the left of the decimal place is the first non-zero digit in your bank account.
Mm-hmm.
While India, there's other classes that are, that's the history of their last names. That's why there's so many recurring last names. They used to label the class you were in by this last name. So yeah, I don't know for sure if it's true, but it does seem reasonable. And that's part of what struck me in this film, is teaching in a Sikh cultural school. The Sikhs were, they're in the northwest region of India with the Punjabi, and there's no mention of them. And there's been some serious internal strife with the Sikhs in their treatment. Yeah, you tell a Westerner, you make reference to 1984, they assume you're talking about the George Orwell book. That would not be the case for a Sikh. 1984 was not a good year for the Sikhs in India. But that's not what this movie touches on. This is, like I said, it ends in 1948, as Gandhi's life did. So even though that George Orwell he actually wanted to call it 1948 when he published it in 1946, but his editor said, no, that's too close. People are not going to accept that. So they reversed the digits to make it 84.
Yeah, and we're starting to see a little bit of a filming convention. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call Chariots of Fire a biopic. It's a little bit more event-focused than that. But, much like Chariots of Fire, much like Lawrence of Arabia, we're starting with the death of the lead character whose story we're about to be told.
Yeah, and honestly, when they do that, to me it feels like the TV shows where the pre-credits teaser is a scene from the third or fourth act, and then when you get there, it's different context. I've always found that feels like a cheat because they can't figure out how to come up with a strong opening.
Mm-hmm.
Should we talk about some of the other notable stars that didn't make the top 2 or 3 names that are in here?
I will admit to our listeners, normally when I do the preamble, I pull like the top 3 or 4 names that are credited. I didn't in this case because it has such a strong supporting and cameo cast that I would be citing people who had 5 minutes of screen time and leaving out the actors who are in 2 hours of the movie. So I hope our listeners indulge me there. But yeah, I think this is a film that's carried on its acting. And it just shows in that, every part, no matter how small, has an extremely strong actor, whether that's one of those character actors that is a king in the that person field, or just a major star in their own right. We're not too far away from Apocalypse Now, and Martin Sheen is in this.
Yeah, you mentioned Ian Charleston, who we just discussed in Chariots of Fire.
Mm-hmm.
Played actually a similar character there. So here he is a preacher or a priest, and he's the Anglican priest, and he was the missionary in the last one.
If it wasn't for the time being slightly off, and them both supposing to be real people, you could see the character from Chariots of Fire getting diverted to India and South Africa instead of China, and it be the same character.
Yeah, it's really close in that case. We also have Candice Bergen in a small role as a reporter who does her own photography. We've got Daniel Day-Lewis as Colin, who I'm seeing on the cast list here. I don't even remember this character.
So when he is walking down the street in South Africa, and I think it's with the Ian Charleston character, and they are accosted by 3 young white males, and they're quote unquote saved by the mother hollering out the window that they're late for work. The one that gets all up in Ben Kingsley's face, whose mother it is hollering out the window, that was Daniel Day-Lewis.
Okay.
That was Colin.
All right, yeah, so that was, like as you said, less than 5 minutes of screen time. Now I remember the character. We've got John Gielgud. We've talked about him a couple of times before.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Trevor Howard in here.
Yes. One of 2. You could take it back to Superman for Michael Bailey's, because I think most people would know him as, one of the main Kryptonian councils in the Phantom Zone scenes from Superman and Superman 2, Tony, guilty.
Yep, he was in there. We have got John Ratzenberger as a driver.
Yep.
So he was Candice Bergen's driver in this. You've already mentioned Martin Sheen, yeah?
Yeah, I was going to say John Ratzenberger was the other Superman tie-in I could think of, because he was one of the military personnel with the missile, I think, in Superman the movie. I'm wondering if he was in Pinewood Studios or around Pinewood Studios at this time, because it's around roughly the same time he was in Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, it could be, because he was definitely getting work. Of course, now he's probably best known to our generation as Cliff Clavin from Cheers, and then the younger generations would know him from he's almost like the patron saint of Pixar, where they've got some voice for him in virtually every movie they make.
Yep. Predominantly, he's Ham in the Toy Story films.
Yeah. And another actor who's on screen for about 5 minutes is Richard Griffiths, who is probably best known now as Vernon Dursley in the Harry Potter films.
Yep. And Ian Charleston, who talked about, and John Gielgud, all 3 of them were in the last film we covered, Chariots of Fire.
So now, when it comes to casting, we do have a little bit of an elephant in the room. This movie is now, 41 years old at the time of this recording. They'll be closer to 42 by the time our listeners hear it. If they were making this today, I don't think they would take a white British guy and put him in brown face makeup for the lead role.
So, maybe. I don't know if this makes it better or not. Ben Kingsley's father was Indian, so it's not that he was entirely appropriating a culture that wasn't from his background.
Yeah, it was a little closer, but it's still... If they were to do this casting today, I would see people coming out with articles on whitewashing. It's nowhere near as egregious as some examples we've had in the past, some of which we've talked about, others we haven't. We're not talking about John Wayne as Genghis Khan.
No.
Right. We are not talking about Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
No, or even, Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One in the Doctor Strange film. I thought about it, and I was like, does it, if we would say that it was blackface for him, for example, would you say that Rae Dawn Chong playing an African American role because, she's half African American and half Caucasian, would that be the same thing? It gets tricky when their immediate preceding generation in their family was, of that culture and of that race. So I don't know. I would respect someone's right to be offended, but I think it's much, as you said, much less egregious in this case.
It is. I think it mostly stood out. I didn't know that was his father's heritage because Kingsley is pale enough that you wouldn't necessarily make that connection. So maybe I jumped to a bit of a conclusion there, but I think jumping to conclusions is really common in the online and entertainment discourse these days. So I do think we'd be seeing articles about it. This is not a slight on his performance. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get through which movies won which awards. But his performance is incredible.
Yes.
Like you said, this is a movie that's carried by the actors. And I think there's one or two scenes that he's not in. There are brief scenes with the British government talking about what to do with him, or another brief scene with the conspirators planning his murder. But as we said, this is 3 hours and 11 minutes. And when we include the majestic panoramics for the opening credits, the intermission, the closing credits, there's probably still less than 15 minutes that he's not in.
Right. And again, I understand why a lot of people would have some trouble getting through it and think it's slow. But I think it's a testament to his performance that a lot of people stay with it when, over half the movie, basically him sitting and weaving.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's interacting with characters, and Ben Kingsley is acting with everything he's got. But from a stimulus perspective, other than, that performance, it's very much a talking heads movie, I guess, it is the best way to put it. You have a lot of two-hander scenes.
Yeah, this is a movie where you could multitask it better than a lot of other films as long as you're listening to the dialogue. And it wasn't an easy film to make. So this is one that Attenborough was contacted in 1962 by Motilal Kothari. Wikipedia says that was an Indian-born civil servant working with the Indian High Commission in London, who was a devout follower of Ghandi. So initially, David Lean and Sam Spiegel were going to make a film about Ghandi after completing Bridge on the River Kwai with Alec Guinness in the lead, but then they did Lawrence of Arabia instead. And when Attenborough approached Lean saying, well, I heard you were doing a Gandhi project, I've got my own Gandhi project, Lean was going to direct it with Attenborough in the lead role, which would have been more egregious than Kingsley.
Mm-hmm.
But then Lean ended up doing Ryan's Daughter, and Kothari passed away and that project fell apart. So Attenborough tried bringing it back in 1976 with Warner Brothers, and then Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency in India, so there's no way they'd be able to film on location. So then they finally got it going starting in 1980. But it took almost 20 years for this to begin. So, yeah, and the funeral scene apparently holds the Guinness World Record for having the most extras in a film. It's 300,000 extras, which is a record I'm going to say is going to stand indefinitely because that many people now, it's cheaper to use CGI than to pay the extras.
Yep. It looks great. Now, because of how long ago this was filmed, I don't know if they had access to the actual location, but because of my work and because of the organizations we offshore some of our development with, I've had the opportunity to go to India. I think I've been roughly 3 times in the past decade, and I've visited where he was under house arrest and where they kept him and where he stayed and where his wife died. And the sets if they weren't filming on location, they managed to make identical looking sets.
So they either filmed on location or they probably studied the location thoroughly.
I guess the big tragedy of Gandhi's life, if you would call it that, as portrayed in the film, is that India won its independence, but in some ways Britain was right, and you could definitely say that they kind of created the situation in which they were right, but the independence did, in a very real way, split India apart.
It did, and like I said, I've got colleagues who were born and raised in India who still talk about partition and how it was ultimately not a good thing for India because giving them their own spaces instead of forcing them to work together didn't do a lot to calm the tensions. If anything, it exaggerated them. So we had a lot of people then who felt forced to move if they were a Hindu in the Muslim territory or a Muslim in the Hindu territory. So they had to uproot themselves. So it's...
Yep.
I would say that Gandhi achieved 80 to 90% of his goals, but that 10 to 20%, they're still feeling it today. Did you have any other comments before we move on to the award ceremony?
No, I don't think so.
All right, so the 55th Annual Academy Awards were given on April 11th, 1983 in the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, with shared hosting duties between Liza Minnelli, Dudley Moore, Richard Pryor, and Walter Matthau. So, Best Picture obviously went to Ghandi, beating out E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Missing, Tootsie, and The Verdict. Best Director went to Richard Attenborough, beating out Wolfgang Petersen for Das Boot, Steven Spielberg for E.T., Sidney Pollack for Tootsie, and Sidney Lumet for The Verdict. Best Actor went to Ben Kingsley as Ghandi, beating out Dustin Hoffman in Tootsie, Jack Lemmon in Missing, Paul Newman in The Verdict, and Peter O'Toole in My Favorite Year. Best Actress went to Meryl Streep for Sophie's Choice, beating out Julie Andrews in Victor Victoria, Jessica Lange in Francis, Sissy Spacek in Missing, and Deborah Winger in An Officer and a Gentleman. Best Supporting Actor went to Louis Gossett Jr. for An Officer and a Gentleman, beating out Charles Durning for The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, John Lithgow for The World According to Garp, James Mason for The Verdict, and Robert Preston for Victor Victoria. Best Supporting Actress went to Jessica Lange for Tootsie, beating out Glenn Close for The World According to Garp, Terry Garr for Tootsie, Kim Stanley for Francis, and Leslie Ann Warren for Victor Victoria. Just pausing for a moment to say, that was serious competition in all four categories.
Yes. It occurred to me right before we started recording, 1982, and I realized that cross-dressing and transgender is not the same thing, but in terms of representation for transgender and people who have gender identity, I don't want to say issues, Blaine, help me out here. I guess just people who identify as transgender, this is probably a landmark year in film between Tootsie, Victor Victoria, and The World According to Garp.
Yeah, I will agree that there's three prominent ones, and yeah, it's hard to come up with a better term than issues for the transgender. I will say that most of those issues are being imposed on them from society's reaction to them from the outside. And it's not something that must happen just because they were born in a body that didn't quite fit.
I agree, and I apologize to any of our listeners if that came across as offensive, because that wasn't my intent. I just couldn't find a better word in the moment as I was speaking.
Yeah, and I think that's clear when you were asking for help on that, because that's something that recent years it's become a part of the conversation. And it's... So to be clear, yeah, Trey and I want to be allies. If you have any hints or tips for the vocabulary you can use to be better allies, please email us. 99 years, 100 films at gmail.com is an email address we do not talk about nearly enough, but it's out there. Anyway, best screenplay written directly for the screen. That went to Ghandi, beating out Diner, E.T., An Officer and a Gentleman, and Tootsie. Best screenplay based on material from another medium went to Missing, based on the book The Execution of Charles Horman and the American Sacrifice. That beat out Das Boot, Sophie's Choice, The Verdict, and Victor Victoria, most of which were adapted from novels with the same name. The Victor Victoria was adapted from Victor und Victoria, which was the German musical, but the rest had the same name. Best foreign language film went to Begin the Biguine, beating out Alcino and the Condor, Clean Slate, Flight of the Eagle, and Private Life. I'm going to pause here for a moment and speculate that Das Boot was not submitted in this category, perhaps, considering how well it did in every other category.
I would imagine so.
Best documentary feature went to Just Another Missing Kid, a Canadian documentary, beating out After the Axe, Ben's Mill, In Our Water, and A Portrait of Giselle. The best documentary short subject went to If You Love This Planet, another Canadian documentary, beating out Gods of Metal, The Clan, A Legacy of Hate in America, To Live and Let Die, and Traveling Hopefully. Best live-action short film went to A Shocking Accident, beating out Ballet Robotique, The Silence, Split Cherry Tree, and Srendi Vashtar. Best animated short film went to Tango by Zbigniew Rybczynski. I'm not sure about the pronunciation of the last name, but I had a teacher or professor at university with the same first name, so I'm fairly confident in Zbigniew. That beat out The Great Cognito and The Snowman. Best original score, E.T. the Extraterrestrial by John Williams, beat out Ghandi, done by Ravi Shankar and George Fenton. An Officer and a Gentleman, that was by Jack Nietzsche, Poltergeist by Jerry Goldsmith, and Sophie's Choice by Marvin Hamlish. Best original song score and its adaptation or adaptation score, that went to Victor Victoria, beating out Annie and One from the Heart. Best original song, that went to Up Where We Belong from An Officer and a Gentleman, beating out Eye of the Tiger from Rocky III, How Do You Keep the Music Playing from Best Friends, If We Were in Love from Yes Giorgio, music by John Williams and lyrics by Ellen and Marilyn Bergman, and It Might Be You from Tootsie by with music by David Grusin and lyrics by the Bergmans. In fact, the Bergmans also did the lyrics for How Do You Keep the Music Playing? So they were nominated for 3 songs in this category. And that's one of those 5 songs. There are 2 that I can still clearly remember, and one of which won.
Yep.
Best sound effects editing went to E.T. the Extraterrestrial, beating out Das Boot and Poltergeist. Best sound, E.T. the Extraterrestrial beat out Das Boot, Ghandi, Tootsie, and Tron. Best makeup went to Quest for Fire, beating out Ghandi. Best costume design went to Ghandi. That's for John Molo and Banu Athaya, beating out La Traviata, Sophie's Choice, Tron, and Victor Victoria. Best art direction went to Ghandi. That was to Stuart Craig and Robert W. Lang for art direction and Michael Searton for set direction, beating out Annie, Blade Runner, La Traviata, and Victor Victoria. Best cinematography went to Ghandi for Billy Williams and Ronnie Taylor, beating out Das Boot, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Sophie's Choice, and Tootsie. Best film editing, John Bloom took it home for Ghandi, beating out Das Boot, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, An Officer and a Gentleman, and Tootsie. And best visual effects, E.T. the Extraterrestrial beat out Blade Runner and Poltergeist. Tron was excluded from this category, which is the first ever Best Visual Effects competitive category, because they felt the extensive use of computers was cheating.
How times have changed.
The honorary Academy Award went to Mickey Rooney, and the Jean Hirschholt Humanitarian Award went to Walter Mirisch. The films with multiple nominations, Ghandi had 11 nominations, Tootsie had 10, E.T. had 9, 7 for Victor Victoria, 6 each for Das Boot and An Officer and a Gentleman, 5 each for Sophie's Choice and The Verdict, 4 for Missing, 3 for Poltergeist, and 2 each for Annie, Blade Runner, Francis, La Traviata, Tron, and The World According to Garp. And the multiple award winners, Ghandi won 8, E.T. won 4, and An Officer and a Gentleman won 2.
So, I won't dispute the best director, and I certainly wouldn't dispute the best actor. In the moment, you could argue that the Academy made the right choice, but out of the ones that have been nominated that I've seen, and I've seen all of them except for Missing, I think Gandhi least stands the test of time. I don't think it engages the modern audience still. So in that regard, I could see, especially Tootsie and E.T., which were both popular hits for the year, I could see them, through a modern lens, being considered a better contender for Best Picture than Gandhi.
Yeah, I would also lean toward E.T., as would Richard Attenborough. So, the producer and director of Ghandi went to Steven Spielberg after the ceremony saying, the Academy messed up. E.T. should have won both of those awards. And as his way of apologizing and kind of making up for that, he told Spielberg, if you need me for anything, call and I'm there. Which is how he ended up playing John Hammond in Jurassic Park.
Okay.
We won't get into how things stood up on IMDb and Letterboxd, but that's an interesting conversation this week. We'll table that for later.
Okay.
But yeah, I have not seen Missing or The Verdict yet. But of the other three, I would say that the Academy did a good job in selecting the nominees this year.
Yes.
But I would give the edge to E.T. in the long term. I wonder if E.T. didn't win because it takes a long time for the Academy to recognize anything science fiction and fantasy, or often even stuff that's aimed at children. They want something a little more mature often than something that is family entertainment. So, and they do love their epic biopics.
Yes. We've got at least one more that we're covering this decade, if not 2 or 3. So. Yeah,
just looking ahead, we have 2 epic biopics and a couple of character pieces coming up. So yeah, we've got Terms of Endearment, Amadeus, Out of Africa, Platoon, The Last Emperor, Rain Man, and Driving Miss Daisy. So Amadeus and Last Emperor, I'll talk. Those I believe are the epic biopics.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen part of one,
and it's been a while since I've been exposed to it. Out of Africa may or may not be the story of real people, so that's where I was getting my 2 or 3 from, but I don't know.
It could be. Just tipping my hand, usually we leave this for the actual discussion. Amadeus and Out of Africa were the first, or 2 of the first 3 Best Picture winners where I was actually in the theater to watch them. The age I was at the time and how slow they were, I fell asleep. I have no clear memory of either film. So I'm actually looking forward to revisiting them to see if maybe I've missed it, because one of those in particular is still very much discussed in the film buff groups and in social media. As for the others, so we said, like I said, all 4 of these acting categories, that's a murderer's row. I mean, we've got 19 names here because Jessica Lange was nominated in 2 categories. And Kim Stanley is the only one where I couldn't place immediately things I've seen her in. And looking at it, okay, so she was the narrator in To Kill a Mockingbird.
Mm.
She was in The Chase, Picnic, The Goddess, Seance on a Wet Afternoon. She's done a lot of work in theater, including Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. So, yeah, her filmography is short because most of her work is theater. So, her filmography on Wikipedia is The Goddess, To Kill a Mockingbird, Seance on a Wet Afternoon, The Three Sisters, Frances, which is where she was nominated, and The Right Stuff. A lot of televised plays, but yeah, it's mostly her theater work. So that could be why she's the one that didn't jump out at me. But again, a lot of stage work. But others like Robert Preston, James Mason, who we talked about from Gentleman's Agreement, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Right, John Lithgow, Charles Durning, Glenn Close. Like, looking at these acting categories, you know, I haven't seen An Officer and a Gentleman, and I haven't seen Sophie's Choice, but just looking at who was nominated, I don't think I would have been upset regardless of which nominee took home the award in any of these categories.
Yep.
Yeah, they were all very strong. I would say that the biggest surprise is not seeing Das Boot take foreign language film, especially up against 5 other films, only 4 of which I've heard of, or 4 of which I've never heard of. Flight of the Eagle's the only one I've heard of. So do we have any other comments on the Oscars before we go on to the Golden Globes?
No. I'm ready to move on to the Golden Globes.
Okay. Oh, actually, I just realized I do have one other comment. I love Blade Runner. It only had those 2 nominations. For others who love it, who are saying it was excluded because of the sci-fi fantasy bias, remember that in 1982, the only version that was available was the theatrical release. And I think it's really the director's cut that catapulted it into the cult classic it is now. So that the most beloved versions of Blade Runner were not available to be voted on.
You know, the one to where I could see maybe a good argument being made, and, you know, I guess it goes into what you define as art direction. But that's one of the spots to where Blade Runner definitely had a unique look, and inventing a look for a period that doesn't exist, I think, is more difficult than recreating a period. So, you know, I could see an argument that maybe it should have won Best Art Direction, where all of the other nominees were trying to recreate the look of a period.
Yeah, you can make that case. I'd have to take a look at the other nominees for Best Original Score. I will not dispute that John Williams deserved to win for E.T., but I think you could make the case that Vangelis' score for Blade Runner should have been on the nominees list as well.
Mm-hmm.
But again, to me, one of the reasons I love that film is the ambiguity in the director's cut about whether or not Deckard is a replicant himself, which apparently the screenwriter says was an accident because they were cutting for length and they cut out an entire character. But then early in the film, Edward James Olmos' character, when he talks about how many had escaped, he still uses the original number because he didn't go back and change that. So there is one other replicant that's not accounted for based on that line of dialogue. And when Ridley Scott was brought on board, he picked up on that and thought, oh, we're missing one. It must be Deckard. And so Harrison Ford thought Deckard should have been a human sympathetic to the replicants. The screenwriter said Deckard was a human sympathetic to the replicants. In the novel, there's no question that Deckard is human, but that was changed dramatically to make Blade Runner. That Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a good book, but this is one of the least faithful adaptations, and frankly, it needs to be, because in the novel, he spends about a third of the book holding 2 handles on the side of a machine and thinking. And it's an interesting internal dialogue, but that works so much better in print than on screen.
Mm-hmm.
It deals with a lot of the same themes, but it goes in a completely different direction. So if you're familiar with one and not the other, you might like one and not the other. It is one of the least faithful Hollywood adaptations I've ever seen, and yet both are good. There's not a lot of those. Anyway, 40th Annual Golden Globes. Shall we move on to those?
Yes.
Okay, so the awards were given on January 29th, 1983 at the Beverly Hills Hilton. So, Best Motion Picture Drama, E.T. won, beating out Missing, An Officer and a Gentleman, Sophie's Choice, and The Verdict. Best Motion Picture Comedy or Musical went to Tootsie, beating out Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, Diner, My Favorite Year, and Victor Victoria. Best Actor in a Drama went to Ben Kingsley as Ghandi, beating out Alfred Finney for Shoot the Moon, Richard Gere for An Officer and a Gentleman, Jack Lemmon for Missing, and Paul Newman for The Verdict, which has 2 names the Academy did not nominate, but still 5 really strong contenders.
Yep.
Actress in a Drama, they agree, Meryl Streep for Sophie's Choice, beating out Diane Keaton for Shoot the Moon, Jessica Lange for Frances, Sissy Spacek for Missing, and Deborah Winger for An Officer and a Gentleman. Now, Best Performance in a Motion Picture Musical or Comedy This is where we find the quote-unquote missing nominees that the Academy recognized. Best Actor went to Dustin Hoffman for Tootsie, beating out Peter O'Toole for My Favorite Year, Al Pacino for Author, Robert Preston for Victor Victoria, and Henry Winkler for Night Shift. Actress went to Julie Andrews for Victor Victoria, beating out Carol Burnett for Annie, Sally Field for Kiss Me Goodbye, Goldie Hawn for Best Friends, Dolly Parton for Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and Eileen Quinn for Annie. Supporting Actor in any genre, that went to Louis Gossett Jr. for An Officer and a Gentleman, beating out Raul Julia for Tempest, David Keith for An Officer and a Gentleman, not to be confused with Keith David, James Mason for The Verdict, and Jim Metzler for Tex.
That's almost except for James Mason and Louis Gossett Jr., that's almost a completely different list.
Yes, the other three were three totally different names. Some of that might actually be, we see Robert Preston was nominated for Best Supporting for the Academy Award, but he was actually in the Best Actor category for the Golden Globes. Possibly because they split by genre. So you have an extra category to compete in. Supporting Actress, again, Jessica Lange for Tootsie. So in terms of the awards that went home, it's a perfect match. Everyone who won the Oscar won.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they've got extra categories of the Golden Globes, but everyone who took home an Oscar also took home a Golden Globe.
Right.
Yeah, so Jessica Lange won for Tootsie. Cher was nominated for Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean. Lainey Kazan was nominated for My Favorite Year, Kim Stanley for Frances, and Leslie Ann Warren for Victor Victoria. So again, Cher and Lainey Kazan are new to the list. Best Director, that went to Richard Attenborough for Ghandi, beating out Costa Gavras for Missing, Sidney Lumet for The Verdict, Sidney Pollack for Tootsie, and Steven Spielberg for E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Best Screenplay went to Ghandi, beating out E.T., Missing, Tootsie, and The Verdict. Best Original Score went to E.T. the Extraterrestrial, beating out Blade Runner by Vangelis, Cat People by Giorgio Moroder, 6 Weeks by Dudley Moore, and the Victor Victoria score by Henry Mancini. Best Original Score went to Up Where We Belong from An Officer and a Gentleman, beating out Putting Out Fire from Cat People, Eye of the Tiger from Rocky III, If We Were in Love from Yes Giorgio, and the title track from Making Love. Best Foreign Film, that went to Ghandi, because it was actually a co-production from the United Kingdom and India. Because remember, the Golden Globes do it by the country that's paying for it, whereas the Oscars at this time do it according to what language the film is in. They do foreign language film.
Right.
As though English is the only American language. That beat out Fitzcarraldo from West Germany, La Traviata from Italy, The Man from Snowy River from Australia, Quest for Fire from Canada and France, and Y'all from Switzerland and Turkey.
And I looked real quick. I didn't actually look at the release dates for Das Boot Blaine, but I'm assuming that they have different consideration rules at this point. Das Boot was up for the Best Foreign Film Golden Globe for last year. That's why it's not competing this year. It lost to Chariots of Fire because, as you said, since it was a British film, it competed under Best Foreign last year instead of Best Drama.
Yeah, okay, from what I'm seeing, Das Boot was originally released in West Germany on September 17th, 1981, and didn't come to North America. It was actually Canada, US, and Turkey all had it February 10th, 1982. So yeah, that'll be the difference there when the Golden Globes probably go by the release date in the country of origin. New Actor for the Year, or New Star of the Year for Actor, that went to Ben Kingsley for Ghandi, beating out David Keith for An Officer and a Gentleman, Kevin Kline for Sophie's Choice, Eddie Murphy for 48 Hours, and Henry Thomas for E.T. the Extraterrestrial. So he was Elliot. So I'd say 4 of those 5 have done a lot of work since.
Mm-hmm.
New Star of the Year Actress, that went to Sandel Bergman for her role as Valeria in Conan the Barbarian, beating out Lisa Blount from An Officer and a Gentleman, Catherine Healy for 6 Weeks, Amy Madigan for Love Child, Eileen Quinn for Annie, and Molly Ringwald for The Tempest. So that's a little bit different. There's Molly Ringwald, and I'm not sure.
Amy Madigan, you may not recognize the name, but she's been in films like Uncle Buck and Field of Dreams, so you may have seen her in things and just not know the name.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing here following that link through. So yeah, I haven't seen Field of Dreams since we watched it in class in the early 90s. And otherwise going through her... Yeah, she's got a pretty lengthy filmography here, but I don't know what else I would have seen her in. Okay, she was one of the callers on Frasier, so I would not know her just from the voice from that. She was in 2 episodes of Criminal Minds, Grey's Anatomy, ER, Law & Order, Fringe. Okay. Yeah, she does have a pretty extensive filmography. I just haven't gotten around to seeing most of what she's in. So for multiple nominations, An Officer and a Gentleman was up for 8. There were 5 nominations each for E.T., Ghandi, Missing, Tootsie, The Verdict, and Victor Victoria. 3 each for Annie, My Favorite Year, and Sophie's Choice. 2 each for Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, Francis Shoot the Moon, 6 Weeks in the Tempest. Gandhi won 5, Tootsie won 3, and An Officer and a Gentleman and E.T. won 2 each. Shall we pause to discuss those before we go on to the TV?
No, I think once you take into account, you kind of said it best when we got through the actors. Once you take into account the differences in the categories, the Golden Globes were fairly identical in who won to the Oscars.
Yeah, they were pretty consistent in the winners, if not the nominees. Okay, so Best Television Series. For Drama, Hill Street Blues won, beating out Dallas, Dynasty, Heart to Heart, and Magnum P.I. For Musical or Comedy, Fame won, beating out Cheers in its first year, as well as Love, Sidney, MASH, and Taxi. Which is funny, because Cheers was almost cancelled after that first year, because it did so poorly in the ratings. But the network president's wife was a huge fan of the show, to the point that she said, if you cancel that, I'm divorcing you. So it got another shot, and eventually became a juggernaut. So Best Performance in a Television Series Drama, that went to John Forsythe for Dynasty, beating out Larry Hagman for Dallas, Tom Selleck for Magnum P.I., Daniel Travanti for Hill Street Blues, and Robert Wagner for Heart to Heart. Actress in the drama went to Joan Collins for Dynasty, beating out Linda Evans for Dynasty, Stephanie Powers for Heart to Heart, Victoria Principal for Dallas, and Jane Wyman for Falcon Crest. Best Performance in a Television Series, Musical or Comedy, Best Actor went to Alan Alda, playing Hawkeye on MASH, beating out Robert Guillaume for Benson, Judd Hirsch for Taxi, Bob Newhart for Newhart, and Tony Randall for Love, Sidney. Best Actress went to Debbie Allen for Fame, beating out Eileen Brennan for Private Benjamin, Nell Carter for Gimme a Break, Bonnie Franklin for One Day at a Time, Rita Moreno from 9 to 5, and Isabel Sanford for The Jeffersons. Best Performance in a Miniseries or Television Film, actor went to Anthony Andrews for Brideshead Revisited, beating out Philip Anglim for The Elephant Man, Robbie Benson for Two of a Kind, Jeremy Irons for Brideshead Revisited, and Sam Waterston for Oppenheimer, which is interesting considering we are recording this a couple weeks before Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer is going to open.
Mm-hmm.
Best Actress went to Ingrid Bergman for A Woman Called Golda, beating out Carol Burnett for Life of the Party, The Story of Beatrice, Lucy Guttridge for Little Gloria, Happy at Last, and Jillian for Mae West, Lee Remick for The Letter, and Jean Stapleton for Eleanor, First Lady of the World, as Eleanor Roosevelt. Best Supporting Performance in a Series, Miniseries, or Television Film, Supporting Actor went to Lionel Stander for Heart to Heart as Max. He beat out Pat Harrington Jr. for One Day at a Time, John Hillerman for Magnum P.I., Lorenzo Lamas for Falcon Crest, and Anson Williams for Happy Days. Supporting Actress, that went to Shelley Long for her role in Cheers as Diane Chambers, beating out Valerie Bertinelli for One Day at a Time, Marilu Henner for Taxi, Beth Boland for Alice, Carol Kane for Taxi, and Loretta Swit for MASH. Bit of a non sequitur, but we're also recording this 4 episodes into the second season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and I'm loving Carol Kane's character. Best Miniseries or Television Film went to Brideshead Revisited, beating out Eleanor, First Lady of the World, In the Custody of Strangers, Two of a Kind, and A Woman Called Golda. There are multiple nominations. went 4 nominations each for Dynasty, Heart to Heart, and Taxi. 3 nominations each for Brideshead Revisited, Dallas, Magnum P.I. MASH, and One Day at a Time. And 2 each for Cheers, Eleanor, First Lady of the World, Fame, Hill Street Blues, Love Sydney, Two of a Kind, and A Woman Called Golda. And the shows that actually won multiple awards, Brideshead Revisited, Dynasty, and Fame won 2 each. And they gave their Cecil B. DeMille Award to Laurence Olivier. So any comments on the TV?
No, I always, like, most of the big winners, even if my family didn't watch them, just osmosis, I know about them. Like, I don't know that we ever watched Dynasty, for example, but, I know Fame, MASH, Cheers, Hill Street Blues. I always like it when we come across the programs that time's forgotten. Like, I almost want to go and see if there are episodes of Love Sydney on YouTube or something, because I have never heard of that show.
Yeah, when I got to the end of that category, I almost started singing that Sesame Street, "One of these things is not like the others," which I hesitated because sometimes that's just a show that didn't get picked up for syndication in Canada, but is all over the place in the States. So looking at how things play out on the IMDb, before we go on to Letterboxd. So, of the 5 nominees, the highest rated on the IMDb is Ghandi, with an 8.0. That makes it 13th for the year. And again, that's feature films with at least 1,000 votes. E.T. is number 17, The Verdict is number 24, Missing is 25, and Tootsie is number 39, with a 7.4 rating. So, IMDb says that Ghandi should have taken it. Letterboxd is a little different. So, Letterboxd puts The Verdict in the highest spot. That's the 16th on the list, where all I've done there is just try to hide documentaries, shorts, just keep it at featured films. No unreleased films, but there's no language sorting or minimum votes available. So they put The Verdict at 16th for the year, Missing at 28th, E.T. is 29th, Tootsie is 78th, and Ghandi is number 90. So they actually put Ghandi at the bottom of the list, whereas IMDb puts it at the top. So interesting that amongst ourselves, we are closer to the IMDb. We're saying Ghandi is strong, but E.T. is next in line, aside from the IMDb putting Tootsie last. But some of that, there are some people who are just going out and giving low ratings to anything that involves cross-dressing or things that they don't personally care for. But yeah, I was actually surprised to see Ghandi come out last on Letterboxd. It's at 3.7 out of 5. Tootsie's a 3.71. E.T. is 3.85. Missing is 3.86. And The Verdict is a 3.95 for the ratings.
Huh.
So there's not as much of a correlation between the ratings as we are used to. In fact, the correlation is only a 0.04 correlation, which I haven't calculated before, but I built a spreadsheet to track these down, so I might do that from now on. So yeah, I don't think we've seen this much disagreement between IMDb and Letterboxd before.
No.
Okay, so I guess now we move on to who would we recommend this to?
On the whole, I would say it's a fairly inoffensive film. There's some, there's some strong language, and there are racists being racist. I mean, if you removed that from the film, you'd have absolutely nothing for Ghandi to react against, right? So, I don't necessarily think there's any particular content warnings or anything. I think, if you're interested in getting a sense of one of the most important world figures of the 20th century, and you can tolerate or are forewarned that, it's a slower film, there's conflict in a broad sense, but not necessarily in a personal sense to drive the narrative forward, then I would recommend it. Where I have a small bit of hesitancy is while I can't deny this was a really good movie, I fall just shy of calling it a great movie because I don't know that I need to see it again.
That is fair. I would also agree it's unlikely to offend anyone directly. As you've said, or even as I'm seeing here on the IMDb Parents Guide, for sex and nudity, there's none. Profanity is mild, and going through the list, we basically have, use of the word bastard, but most of the quote-unquote mild profanity is racial slurs. And the context of the film makes it clear that the people using those terms are wrong to be using those terms.
Mm-hmm.
There's no alcohol, drugs, or smoking. They've got moderate for frightening and intense scenes, and the only specific is when Gandhi's hunger striking and comes close to death. I will agree that the violence and gore is moderate. That's most of it. There are some police who are tasked with making sure people do not cross this line under any circumstances. There are beatings. It starts and ends with Gandhi's assassination. But again, it's not gratuitous. Like, these are historical events, and they show enough to evoke the emotional response and then stop. The decapitation is off screen. You don't see them strike someone on the head, but you'd see the officer swinging a baton in one shot, and then the person falling down with blood on their head in another shot. They'll do the quick cut to avoid the specific impact. So yeah, they can't tell this story without depicting the violence that was happening, but they don't glorify it. They don't revel in it. They are pulling back as much as they can. So yeah, for content warnings, yeah, I'd be more concerned about the pacing than the content. Ghandi was an incredible figure. If you are interested in him, then this is worth checking out, because I think it does give a pretty clear picture.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on how historically accurate it is. There's no question that Ghandi changed the world using methods that not enough people are using. Others are more inclined to pick up the weapon rather than put it down. So he should be a role model to those trying to change the world. But yeah, it's not one where I'm going to say, get out and watch it. It's not a huge recommendation for me in that sense. So yeah, it's, if you have the slightest inclination to watch it, do it, because it's good. But yeah, I'm with Trey in the sense that I'm happy I watched it. I don't know when or if I'll watch it a second time. So shall we let people know what to expect next month?
Next time, we have James L. Brooks directing Shirley MacLaine, Deborah Winger, and Jack Nicholson in Terms of Endearment. Also nominated were The Big Chill, The Dresser, The Right Stuff, and Tender Mercies.
So join us next month for that. And thank you for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Please, sir, I want some more.